US President Donald Trump has said that he's aware of the conspiracy theories circulating around the sudden death of his ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, but declared that the FBI was wasting time investigating the matter.
On a Saturday night in July 2026, Donald Trump picked up the phone for what he thought was just another conversation with an old friend. Senator Lindsey Graham had just landed back in Washington after his 10th trip to Ukraine, tired from the travel, but already thinking about the next fight. A Russia sanctions bill he'd spent months building bipartisan support for, and the Save America Act he was determined to push through Congress. Trump would later describe him as sounding a little tired, but perfect. Neither man knew it would be their last conversation. Hours later, Graham was dead at 71, and the tributes that followed revealed a friendship and a political partnership far more complicated and far more important than most Americans had ever fully understood. It's easy, in the flood of tributes that follow any public figure's death, to treat the outpouring as routine, the expected words leaders say when a colleague passes. But the scale and tone of the reaction to Graham's death stood out even in a city accustomed to sudden loss. Within a single news cycle, Republicans and Democrats, who had spent years clashing with Graham on policy, set that history aside to describe, almost uniformly, a man who had made himself personally reachable to nearly everyone in the building, a rarer trait in the Senate than most Americans probably realize. And at the center of it all was Trump, whose own relationship with Graham had traveled a longer and stranger road than almost any other in his political life. Graham had spent the days before his death deep in a kind of quiet, high-stakes diplomacy that defined much of his 3-decade Senate career. He'd met twice with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that week, toured a drone manufacturing facility, and helped broker a bipartisan agreement with the White House on the Russia sanctions legislation he'd championed for years. On Friday, July 11th, he told reporters bluntly that the summer of 2026 was the moment to apply maximum pressure on Vladimir Putin to force real negotiations. That was Graham in his element, exhausted from travel, but unwilling to slow down. So when he called Trump that Saturday evening, the conversation wasn't about his health. It was about legislation. Trump later told NBC News Meet the Press that Graham sounded a little tired but perfect, and that nothing in the call suggested anything was wrong. Later that night, emergency crews responded to a cardiac arrest call at Graham's Capitol Hill home. Paramedics performed CPR and rushed him to the hospital, but he could not be revived. His office confirmed early Sunday morning that he had died from a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary report from the District of Columbia's medical examiner later identified the cause as an aortic dissection, a tear in the body's main artery, brought on by arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Trump's reaction was immediate and public. He posted a tribute on Truth Social within hours, calling Graham one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known, and a true American patriot. He ordered American flags lowered to half-staff across the country, a gesture typically reserved for the nation's most consequential losses. In the days that followed, as he spoke to reporters and gave interviews, Trump returned again and again to the same idea, that Graham's death had come not in retirement, not while resting, but in the middle of the work he loved. To understand why Trump's grief carried the weight it did, you have to go back a decade, to a relationship that began not with friendship but with open contempt. During the 2016 Republican presidential primary, Graham was one of Trump's fiercest critics. He briefly ran for president himself, and after dropping out, threw his support behind Jeb Bush, not Trump. Graham questioned Trump's temperament for the presidency, and Trump responded the way he often did with rivals, by attacking back hard. At a campaign rally in South Carolina, Trump mocked Graham as a lightweight and, in a moment that became infamous, read out Graham's private cell phone number to the crowd, prompting a flood of angry calls and texts. Graham later joked about destroying the phone. In February 2016, Trump told reporters Graham was one of the worst representatives in the country and said he couldn't win a race for dog catcher. Graham, for his part, warned that nominating Trump would lead the party to disaster and never attended the 2016 Republican convention. Then Trump won the presidency, and everything changed. According to reporting on the relationship, the turning point came at a March 2017 lunch that effectively brokered peace between the two men. From there, Graham worked his way steadily into Trump's inner circle. Frequent phone calls, regular rounds of golf, and eventually a level of access and trust that few other Republicans in Washington ever matched. By 2018, Trump was telling a room of Senate Republicans that Graham used to be a great enemy of mine, and now he's a great friend of mine, adding, half in disbelief, that he genuinely liked him. Their relationship wasn't without friction even after that. In 2023, the two clashed publicly over abortion policy, with Trump criticizing Graham's push for a federal ban and Graham refusing to back down. But by 2025, Trump was fully behind Graham's re-election bid, posting a complete and total endorsement on Truth Social and calling him a wonderful friend who had always been there when needed. Graham, in turn, publicly thanked Trump for what he called the greatest political comeback in American history, and the two later appeared together at a fundraiser billed as the Trump-Graham Classic. Graham had just filed for what would have been his fifth term when he died. What made Graham distinct in an increasingly polarized Senate wasn't just his closeness to Trump. It was his ability to maintain real relationships across the aisle, even with people who disagreed with him on almost everything. In the days after his death, tributes arrived from senators who rarely found themselves on Graham's side of a vote. Minnesota's Amy Klobuchar recalled traveling internationally with him and his enthusiasm for the job never fading. New Jersey's Cory Booker pointed to their unlikely partnership on criminal justice reform, which helped produce the First Step Act. Massachusetts' Elizabeth Warren, despite years of policy battles with Graham, remembered him as someone who negotiated with humor and genuine respect. California's Adam Schiff acknowledged his staunch support for Ukraine and his willingness to work across party lines, while Virginia's Mark Warner praised his commitment to national security. Senate Majority Leader John Thune called him a trusted advisor to colleagues and world leaders alike, noting that numerous presidents had relied on his counsel over the years. Even Zelensky, whom Graham had visited just days before his death, said he was deeply saddened and called him a genuine defender of Ukraine. That range of tributes, from progressive Democrats to Trump himself, pointed to something specific about how Graham operated. He built his influence less through television appearances and floor speeches, though he had plenty of those, and more through the relationships he cultivated privately. Phone calls, meetings, quiet negotiations most Americans never saw. His portfolio stretched across some of the thorniest issues in American foreign policy: Ukraine, Israel, Iran, Iraq, military spending, and refugee policy, and colleagues on both sides of the aisle regularly leaned on his experience during moments of crisis. Ask Trump what he remembers most about Graham, and one moment comes up repeatedly: Graham's furious, emotional defense of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh during his 2018 confirmation hearings. Facing allegations that threatened to sink the nomination, Graham delivered an impassioned floor speech defending Kavanaugh and attacking what he called a coordinated political effort to destroy him. It became one of the most replayed moments of his Senate career, and Trump has repeatedly pointed to it as proof of Graham's willingness to fight hard for the things and people he believed in. But Graham's Senate resume went well beyond that single moment. He chaired the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2022, guiding Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the Supreme Court through in the final weeks before the 2020 election. He also helmed the Senate Budget Committee and was widely seen as one of the chamber's leading voices on defense and foreign policy, a reputation built over more than 2 decades since he first won his Senate seat in 2002. Following years representing South Carolina in the House. Long before Graham became one of Trump's closest allies, he was known in Washington for a different, equally defining friendship: his bond with the late Senator John McCain. The two men served together for years, sharing not just committee work, but a genuine personal closeness that colleagues on both sides of the aisle recognized as unusual, even by Senate standards. When McCain died in 2018, Graham was visibly shaken. In an interview at the time, he admitted he had cried repeatedly over the loss and vowed to give his friend and mentor the send-off he deserves when he took the Senate floor to honor him. Their two desks sat side by side, and Graham said he wasn't sure he'd make it through his tribute without breaking down. That friendship mattered to how Graham later approached his relationship with Trump. Graham's early opposition to Trump in 2016 was tied directly to McCain. Graham publicly objected when Trump disparaged McCain's record as a prisoner of war during the campaign, calling the comments disqualifying at the time. It's part of what makes the later transformation of the Trump-Graham relationship so striking. A man who once considered Trump's treatment of his closest friend to be a bright line ended up, within a matter of months after Trump's 2016 win, becoming one of Trump's most reliable defenders in the Senate. Graham's Senate career, which began in 2002 after several terms representing South Carolina's 3rd Congressional District in the House, was defined by a willingness to plant himself in the middle of the country's hardest fights rather than avoid them. He built a reputation as a leading Republican voice on judiciary matters, national security, and foreign affairs, a rare combination that kept him relevant across 4 different presidential administrations. As chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2022, Graham guided some of the most consequential confirmation battles of the era, including Amy Coney Barrett's fast-track confirmation to the Supreme Court in the final weeks before the 2020 election, filling the vacancy left by the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Years earlier, he had also been among the Republicans who blocked President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, a decision that would go on to shape the ideological balance of the court for a generation. His influence extended well past domestic politics. Graham became one of the Senate's most consistent voices on Ukraine policy, making numerous trips to the country throughout the war with Russia and pushing, often across party lines, for continued military and financial support. He was equally vocal on Israel, Iran, and Iraq, and he supported the strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure carried out in coordination with Israel earlier in 2026, describing the operation as necessary to prevent a nuclear-armed Iranian regime. Colleagues frequently pointed to his willingness to stay engaged on difficult, unglamorous foreign policy work, the kind that rarely generates headlines but shapes real outcomes, as one of his most valuable qualities. Graham's death leaves South Carolina and the Senate itself with genuine uncertainty. Because his seat was already up for election this November, the state's process for filling the vacancy and choosing who serves the remainder of the term now unfolds against the backdrop of the 2026 midterms, with voters set to pick his successor on November 3rd. For a Senate Republican conference already working with a narrow majority, and one that has occasionally seen members break from the party line, the loss of one of its most experienced and connected members adds another layer of unpredictability heading into the fall. That uncertainty is part of why so many colleagues, across party lines, framed Graham's death as more than a personal loss. His influence rarely showed up as a single vote or a viral soundbite. It showed up in relationships built over years, the kind that let him call world leaders directly, broker compromises other senators couldn't, and remain relevant to Republican and Democratic administrations alike for more than 2 decades. Graham lived in Seneca, South Carolina, and never married, a fact that friends and colleagues often connected to how thoroughly he immersed himself in the job. Politics wasn't just his career. By most accounts, it was close to the whole of his daily life, which may explain why so many of the tributes after his death focused less on any single accomplishment and more on his sheer constancy. The sense that he was always working, always reachable, always somewhere in the mix of whatever fight was happening that week. For South Carolina Republicans, the immediate question is who steps in to occupy a seat Graham held for more than 2 decades, and how a crowded field of potential successors will shape a state party that had grown accustomed to his particular blend of hawkish foreign policy and deal-making instinct. For the Senate as a whole, the bigger question is whether anyone can replicate the specific kind of influence Graham wielded, not through committee chairmanships or party rank alone, but through a level of personal trust with leaders in both parties, and in capitals well beyond Washington, that had taken decades to build and cannot simply be reassigned to whoever wins in November. In the days since Graham's death, Trump's public comments have followed a consistent thread. He hasn't focused on scandal or spectacle. He's focused again and again on the idea that Graham loved the job, genuinely, until the very end. He's noted that Graham could have rested after an exhausting overseas trip and instead spent his final hours discussing legislation he wanted to get passed. He's called him irreplaceable, telling reporters he didn't know how anyone finds someone like him. That's the story Trump seems most intent on preserving. Not a dramatic secret, not a hidden scandal, but the simple, well-documented fact that Lindsey Graham spent his last conversation talking about work he still wanted to finish. For a man who spent a decade evolving from one of Trump's harshest critics into one of his closest allies in Washington, that may be the most fitting legacy of all, a career and a friendship built entirely on showing up again and again when it mattered. As South Carolina and the Senate now turn to the question of who comes next, Graham's decades of relationships with presidents, with rivals, with foreign leaders who trusted his counsel, leave a gap that no single successor is likely to fill in the same way. Whether he's remembered most for the legislation he passed, the alliances he built, or the friendship he forged with a president who once wanted nothing to do with him, Lindsey Graham's final chapter in Washington closed the way most of his career unfolded, quietly working the phones, right up until the end.